do it using the rules, and you do it by the rules, and you declare all those donations properly, which is how the system's supposed to work. That isn't what's happened here. So that's why the questions are being raised, because when you take money from people with very clear business interests, you make interventions in British politics that appear to be in line with those business interests, and the British public and British voters don't even know that you've taken a huge sum of money from those individuals because it's not been declared.
Every day at just after 9 o'clock here on Times Radio, we discuss the biggest stories of the morning, and today we are joined by the former Conservative Minister Paul Scully. Paul, good morning.
Morning to you, Rosie.
Hi, Paul.
And the Times columnist and former Labour advisor Sonia Sodha. Morning, Sonia.
Welcome,
Morning,
Sonia.
Rosie.
Well, here are some of the stories we've covered so far this morning on Times Radio Breakfast. The Sunday Times Insight team have revealed fresh allegations about a secret deal struck between Nigel Farage and Richard Tice. The former Reform UK deputy leader, Ben Habib, spoke to this programme earlier.
Things get into a bit of a mess for Farage, and I'm afraid for Richard Tice as well, because Farage is now on the record saying that he had no intention of coming back until the 3rd of June and that he was not politically active before the general election.
The Sunday Times has an exclusive interview with the new AI minister, Kanisha Narayan. He says not all AI will be brilliant. People are right to worry for their children. Well, as well as the fears over AI, the minister's made the case for building up Britain's tech capabilities to grab a share of the AI bounty. Ramzan Karmali is a business journalist and said this.
I think the conclusion from this is that people who are worried that AI are coming for your jobs, their worries shouldn't just be dismissed. They should be sort of embraced to a certain extent. But he says, people shouldn't worry too much. But he has likened sort of the AI revolution to the sort of industrial revolution, and says that certain jobs will disappear, and it's people need to sort of skill up, need to embrace AI.
As the hot weather remains relentless, are we starting to see a move to a more European style of working? More people are choosing to clock off early on a Friday afternoon. We spoke to the business journalist Lucy Tobin, who said,
it seems to be across the board. When I was researching this, first of all, I started getting a load of out of offices on a Friday from, as you say, big companies, but also startups, small companies. For family-run businesses, it can be the only way to make it work.
The irony of researching people working shorter days and not being able to get responses from any of them. Also, as we've just been hearing, mental health experts are starting to explore what the potential benefits could be to de-diagnosing, specifically ADHD. Andy Burnham has made it seem as though he wants to make it more difficult for some people to claim disability benefits. Well, the journalist Charlotte Linton has been exploring this for her piece in the Sunday Times.
So this is obviously a large rise in the numbers previously, and experts say that this is particularly notable within the past few years. So this is the reason it comes up as a discussion point quite frequently, and obviously now with the Prime Minister looking at the welfare bill, it's under scrutiny again.
So lots for us to discuss in the next half an hour. Shall we start, though, with the Times front page and the investigation from the Sunday Times Insight team revealing that the Reform UK leader Nigel Farage struck a secret deal with the then leader Richard Tice and the convicted fraudster George Cottrell to return as leader of Reform UK in March 2024. The date is important because that's several months before he'd previously claimed to have made that decision when, after Rishi Sunak called the snap general election, Nigel Farage said, "I changed my mind." Well, the Sunday Times reporting would suggest that's not true. Sonia, I'll start with you. This is the latest in several stories about backroom sort of dealings, where Reform UK were either personally or to the party getting their money from. To what extent do you think, Sonia, this is taking what has been an absolutely meteoric rise for the party? To what extent is it taking the shine off? Is it having an impact?
Well, I don't think it's the only thing that's taking the shine off Reform. I think that the dip that we've seen for Reform in the polls started well before some of these revelations. But let's just say it's certainly not helping. And where Reform are today does suggest that it's cutting through with some of the public. I think when you take a step back, these are a really, really important set of questions. It's very, very important reporting by the Sunday Times Insight team about propriety of donations, where the money is coming from, why it's not being properly declared with the Electoral Commission, why Nigel Farage is getting personal donations of £5 million shortly before becoming an MP, with from people with specific businesses around cryptocurrency, which is an issue he speaks out on. He's not declaring it. The new revelations today are all about Richard Tice and how Richard Tice may have been paid back by the party for a big loan he gave the party as part of a deal to sort of pave the way for Nigel Farage to come back as leader. He was paid back money, but at the same time, the party was getting donations from Cottrell's mother to sort of make up for the money that it was getting paid back. It all looks incredibly fishy, really, really serious questions to be asked.
Yeah, Paul, the analysis from Josh Galancy in The Times today says even in reform country, this is starting to cut through. I mean, when I spend time in Clacton, I find you do actually find people who through and through support Nigel Farage. It doesn't matter what comes up, they'll say, and they'll echo words you hear from Nigel Farage to say, this is a media stitch-up, this is the establishment coming after him. At what point do you think this might cut through?
I think it's already having some cut through. I think, look, you cannot write off reform, because reform really, their whole thing is latching onto people's disaffection, their frustration, and indeed many people's anger as well. And so that's really potent. So you mustn't write off Nigel Farage or reform, whatever is being thrown at him. And he will always continue to play this I'm the victim. But it's ironic, isn't it, as well, that his whole shtick is about the uni party, about them just doing their own thing without worrying about ordinary people. Yet this is exactly what he is doing. He's playing with rich people's money. He's sort of like saying, "Oh yes," but he's dancing on the head of a pin a little bit in his words. "Oh, I changed my mind." I think what it more sounds like, he hadn't made up his mind, which is slightly different. If he's got a TV news channel to channel out his political views, there's that grey area there that he's already semi-politically campaigning. Whereas, when I was campaigning ahead of election, I had to shove letters through letterboxes and call people up or knock on their doors or whatever. It's a different way of doing things. So you can't have it both ways. But I think people are starting to realise in Clacton, and I've seen Michael Ashcroft today, a focus group as well, and other people have done focus groups where they've been listening to people, that they are saying, I like Nigel Farage, what he stands for, but is he? But I'm holding my nose a little bit.
I'm really interested in this idea because let's be as charitable as we possibly can, and I think Farage is going to get hooked on the fact that political candidates are required to declare anything 12 months before they actually become MPs. But let's be as charitable as possible. You have George Cottrell, who's a British citizen, and you have Christopher Harborne, who is supporter of Reform UK's political ideas. What they want to do is be able to fund that party, and they are looking at ways of doing so. They come up with ways of doing so, and I think, when we hear about the way that political parties get funded and the rules around it, they're quite complicated. What is wrong with two British citizens effectively wanting to give money to the Reform Party? Sonia, you say it stinks, and I appreciate I'm eliding over a lot of the ways in which the money was transferred, but they would say at the end of the day that we are simply concerned British citizens who like what Nigel Farage is selling. Therefore, wouldn't it be sensible for him to go back into politics, be part of the party, and here is some money to help Reform UK function?
Well, then you do it using the rules, and you do it by the rules, and you declare all those donations properly, which is how the system's supposed to work. That isn't what's happened here. So that's why the questions are being raised, because when you take money from people with very clear business interests, you make interventions in British politics that appear to be in line with those business interests, and the British public and British voters don't even know that you've taken a huge sum of money from those individuals because it's not been declared. That's where the problem's coming.
So your interest in all of this is the fact that Nigel Farage was shilling for cryptocurrency and was taking money from a crypto billionaire?
Well, I think that's one aspect of the story, yes, Nick.
OK, what about the Reform UK argument that this is all just a smear campaign? These are technicalities, they're being investigated, they're going to be smoothed over, we all acted in good faith?
Well, it's an interesting way to describe the law, isn't it, around political donations, a very contentious part of our politics, technicalities.
But they are very complicated parts of the way that things operate in this country.
Well,
we heard electoral commission laws being described as a kind of dance.
The law is complicated. Businesses operating in this country, up and down, this country every day, will tell you the law is complicated. There's a reason why we have the law in the country. It's the rule of law, and it's not the case that rich people can ignore it while other businesses, other people have to comply with it. Yeah, sure, it's a bit complicated. This is a party that turns over millions of pounds. Get some lawyers and some accountants.
Yeah,
and there's a fundamental truth there, a fundamental unwritten rule that you just, as a politician, you've got to be whiter than white, and you've got to be seen to be whiter than white as well. So it's the obvious thing that, hold on a sec, I've got £5 million here. I think, but maybe the public ought to know that I've got given this, and they can make their mind up. The reason that Nigel Farage has resigned is because he wants his constituents to make their mind up and be the person. He could have done that 2 years ago. If just be open, be transparent. There's nothing wrong with George Cottrell giving him money. We can judge if we want a convicted fraudster to be funding that. That's for the electors to do. There's nothing wrong for Christopher Harben giving him the money if he's registered, as long as he's registered here. But the public ought to know so they can make their mind up in full knowledge of what's going on.
Which they do now know. And Nigel Farage says, over to you, the residents of Clacton, and in less than 2 weeks' time we'll find out if Nigel Farage manages to win that by-election. Very quickly, before we move on to another topic, Paul, I just want to mention there is another potential problem for Reform UK. If we look at, we've had very fractured politics, we've talked about five-party politics, could it potentially be 6? Because Rupert Lowe's Restore Party, it looks like, is beginning to chip off some support from Reform voters who are sort of, as Josh Glancy describes this morning, hyper engaged on immigration. Restore won almost 9% of the vote in the Greater Manchester mayoral election. That has got to be something that Reform UK are looking at and thinking, we might be outplayed here on those issues.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the thing. You've seen the left splinter over the last few years. The right is further splintering in that way because, right the way from nearly 2 years ago when Elon Musk said that Nigel Farage wasn't being strong enough, and Elon Musk was backing Tommy Robinson and all these kind of things. And he also helped fuel that split between Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe when he said that Rupert Lowe would be a better leader of reform. There are those diehards that are going down that way. And Nigel Farage, in trying to get his party away from being a fringe party and something that looks as though it's ready for government, he's having to make some tough decisions. And whereas Rupert Lowe knows he's not going to be in government, he's continuing to plough his own furrow, and people, the purists about immigration, are going to do that. And that's only going to get worse. I can't see that getting any better.
OK, we're going to move on now and discuss AI at 16 minutes past 9 here on Times Radio Breakfast. Britain's new AI minister, Kanishka Narayan, has told the Sunday Times that he's not going to pretend that the technological revolution brought in by AI is going to be problem-free and that people are right to be worried about the future. But, he says, AI represents an unprecedented jump and that the country has to build up its AI capabilities and build more data centres to avoid sitting out on a technological revolution. Now, Paul Scully, you were a business minister. You were a business minister when AI was nascent. Have we failed to jump on the boat for this? Was this the government's responsibility in not making inroads into AI in the way that it should have done?
Well, I was actually tech minister at that point.
Whoa, so it's all your fault.
Absolutely. So, no, look, I mean, I helped publish the AI white paper where we were right at the heart of the birth of ChatGPT and these kind of things, talking about the safety. Let's talk about the safety, get the safety bit done and understood and debated amongst countries, not just the UK, and then we can look at the benefits of it, about climate change, about medical diagnosis, about productivity and these kind of things. But we need to understand that first. And we spent a lot of time on that, but you were never going to be able to compete with the might of America and the might of China. So we had to find our way, right the way in between. We are still the third biggest AI country in the world. We've got DeepMind was founded here. It's now Google, obviously. Anthropic found their first non-American company over here. We've got the Alan Turing Institute, the Ada Lovelace Institute. We've got amazing academics and practitioners here. What we're not able to do is scale up to the size of America and China.
Is that just because of the natural size of the market, or is it because, or is it because? I mean, you mentioned there, let's get the law right, let's get the regulations right, let's get it safe before we progress. That is a very typical view that the Americans have of Europe. That we're all about regulation, we're all about putting rules rules in place, and that stifles the ability for raw capitalism to make these great leaps forward, which is why they're so far ahead of the game.
Yeah, we know. To be fair, you've got a good point, but it's mainly about economies of scale. America and China can do that, not least China because it's got much more of a tight grip on it. But in terms of regulations, look, I think it's about getting the ground rules. It's not regulations. EU have gone a lot further in regulating than we have. What we decided to do was regulate outcomes, not technologies, because otherwise technologies would be out of date within 5 minutes anyway. So we had to get the ground rules right, because that's where we went wrong with social media. We're 15 years late trying to put a genie back in a bottle. You haven't got 15 years with AI. Jobs will have gone. Other safety measures will be at risk if we don't get it right in the next year or so. So that's why that was really genuinely important. But we do have more to do. We've got to look at how we can be sort of globalist outlook, working with America, but also working with Asia as well, because there's already a lot of companies around America and Europe that are already using open source Chinese models rather than the proprietary models that they have in America. One thing that worries me, Kanishka is actually a really well-respected minister, and the tech sector like him. What worries me, though, is that the government, one of the first things Andy Burnham did was scrap DSIT, the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, and spread Kanishka's role amongst two different departments. And you lose the focus. You absolutely lose the focus between culture, media and sport, the business department, and actually the third department, the cabinet office as well. He really needs a dedicated focus of officials around him, not just his strength.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask Sonia, actually, sort of, how do you feel about the fact that this whole new position has been appointed? Does it give you reassurance that government is going to drive two things? One, the innovation that Paul's just laid out that's required, but also, second of all, steering people through the fear they currently have, which has been admitted, about jobs, not just for their children, but their children's children too.
Well, I do think it's an important signal that the government has appointed a minister for AI, but it is just that. So the devil will be in the detail and what he actually does. The slight concern I had about reading this piece actually is that, he was waxing lyrical about AI and the economic potential of AI, which maybe you would expect from a minister who's appointed to that role. But there is a lot of talk at the moment about an AI bubble in the US and whether it's actually going to deliver, or whether that bubble may at some point burst. So while we definitely want to be exploring the economic potential of AI in our economy, that's just something that's worth being aware of, I think. The other thing I would say is that I think the fears that people have about AI are entirely rational. AI could have huge benefits for society. It also brings huge risks, and we haven't figured out how to regulate it yet. I mean, it doesn't matter whether we have fears about it or not, because there's no way of stopping it, to be honest. But, when people are worried about the impact of AI on jobs, but also the risks of AI in terms of potential, chemical warfare, for example, or taking control of drones, or doing really dark things with people if you develop a therapist-like relationship with your chatbot. These are rational fears to have.
It's a really interesting subject, and I'm sure we'll be returning to it time and again. But I would thoroughly recommend the interview in the Sunday Times with Kanishka Narayan, not just because of what he has to say about AI, but this extraordinary personal story that the minister has. Son of an immigrant who basically sent his family to the UK to better themselves, and really is almost, no, I'm not saying he's got riches at the moment, but he actually isn't doing too badly, is he? It's a rags to riches story, but it really almost brought a lump to my throat when I read it. Definitely worth picking up the Sunday Times for. Right, you are listening to Weekend Breakfast with Rosie and Nick, and we've got Sonia and Paul, who will be back with us after the break.
Still with us, Paul Scully, the former Conservative Minister, and Sonia Sodha, the Times columnist and former Labour advisor. We've been talking this morning about the idea of de-diagnosis. 1 in 5 of us in England have a diagnosed mental health condition. A new concept's emerged from Sweden with a study of 100 adults seeking to overturn their childhood autism or ADHD diagnosis. On initial re-evaluation, 90% no longer met the criteria for their condition. Sonia, is this something we should be looking at? That number feels so stark. 1 in 5 of us, not self-diagnosed, have a diagnosed mental health condition. Do they need revisiting?
Well, I think, So there's definitely suggestions that there may be overdiagnosis, particularly of, I think, ADHD rather than autism, because ADHD ultimately is quite a loose collection of symptoms. I think probably what happened is that the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction, because there was a long time where we were underdiagnosing something like autism. So, for example, 20, 30 years ago, kids with autism, which definitely produces behavioural issues in the classroom and at home, would have just been dismissed as like naughty kids, bad kids, which is really wrong. But I think maybe the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction, where we are doing overdiagnosis, and overdiagnosis is not a good thing either. But again, there's a real risk that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there are children with autism for whom the label, the diagnosis does help, and it does help them get the support they need, even though we do operate a special educational needs system which is not supposed to be based on labels and diagnoses. So I think it's a very sensitive issue. I'm sure there is some overdiagnosis, but I really don't think I would hate for us to sort of say it's all kind of made up, because I know children who've definitely got autism, and they need the support that diagnosis brings them.
Paul, I'd like to get your view on this, because it does worry me that, of course, we should be destigmatising mental health conditions, and it's, in a way, it's great that so many strides have been made in doing so. However, the problem starts, and just what Sonia was saying about the pendulum swinging too far, when a diagnosis of a specific condition becomes part of someone's identity, is there a danger, do you think, that it becomes limiting for them, that the reason they cannot do things is because of their condition? And there's obviously, everyone has a very difficult relationship with whatever they've been diagnosed with, but I wonder whether there's a fundamental problem that needs addressing there, and if so, how you do that without re-stigmatising people with these conditions.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Nick, because I think you're right. If you look back, as Sonia said, to the days when it was underdiagnosed, I think it was because it was seen as a stigma. Now, because people feel that they can get more support for their children when it's done at a child, they're coming forward for diagnosis. And as Sonia said, there are plenty of children who are getting the support that they need, and it's changing their educational outcomes. And obviously, as they get into adult, it's changing their opportunity to get into work as well. So that's a good thing. Around the edges, there is some areas where people are pushing too hard to get their children support that they don't really need. And it's probably not doing them any favours, and certainly into adulthood, as you rightly say. And I know people in I know someone in their adulthood that's actually had a diagnosis later in life, and it's helped her get understand her own brain a little bit more and cope a little bit better, and the medicine that she's on works. But for others, what you've had as a child doesn't necessarily need to carry you right the way through life. We've all changed, whether that's medically or not. And I think in terms of, just finally, in terms of what Andy Burnham's trying to do, I do feel we've got to separate a little bit more emotional well-being and mental health.
But isn't the problem that if you get to a point whereby you don't necessarily need that diagnosis anymore because of whatever support or drugs you might have received, but if it's part of your identity, letting go of that becomes very difficult for some people.
Absolutely, that is very difficult, and that's something that we've got to work harder for in the NHS, because this is where we're starting to strain, as I say, that emotional well-being bit, because you've got to increase people's resilience and fortitude in tackling emotional well-being, but you then need to really double down on making sure that the NHS can cope with proper mental health diagnosis, the more severe mental health diagnosis, that's not just about emotional well-being, because we've only got a finite budget, we've only got a finite amount of people that can treat the people whose needs are greatest.
OK, the news is hard upon us, so I'm going to switch to our last subject this half hour. We've had heatwave after heatwave this summer, certainly by British conditions. It's not something we're used to. The Sunday Times reports today that more and more businesses are starting to cut the working week over summer to help employees with their health and childcare. Sonia, I don't know what your employment status has been like over the last few years, but have you ever been told to knock off early on a Friday because it's too warm by your boss?
Well, I'm self-employed, so
right.
I am my own boss.
Join the club.
work when I want, exactly. So, no, but in all seriousness, I mean, this is up to businesses, isn't it? There are businesses that clearly find that this works for them. Maybe it helps motivate their staff. Maybe the summer is quieter anyway. Lots of people are away in the business world. It does sort of quieten down. So, good for these businesses. And, a big yes, I think, to flexible working and things that work to the benefit of employees and make them more productive. Like, everyone's a winner if you've got a move that employees like and it makes them more productive.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a white collar thing, isn't it? Because if you have to run a cafe, you have to run a cafe, Paul. But I found myself getting up earlier in the morning when it's cooler to do more work, and then just basically not being able to manage anything in the afternoon in these kind of temperatures. I guess, do you think this is a sensible formalisation of that by businesses that employ huge numbers of people like PwC?
Yeah, I think I agree with Sonia that flexibility is a good thing. I think you shouldn't expect it, though, as an employee. I think, in terms of, to an extent, that you shouldn't take advantage of it. It needs to be a sensible balance between the employer and the employee. And as an employer, I would always be outcome focused. Are the projects getting done? Is the work getting done? Rather than necessarily, are they just here 9 to 5 or whatever the hours are? We've just talked about AI, by the way, and AI agents do not take time off.
Yes.
And so if you go too far, that's what I meant about not going too far the other way, because that's a surefire way of your job getting taken over as soon as AI can do so.
It's relentless, AI. And so is the weather. So we've got to find a big compromise. Thank you both very, very much. It's been a pleasure. Paul Scully, the former Conservative Minister, and Sonia Sodha, the Times columnist and former Labour advisor.